to see and meet all of you. I hope we can talk a little more after the presentation. But yeah, like William said, I'm talking about environmental knowledge and type 2 diabetes science. But first, before I get started on my own research, I actually want to do an icebreaker. And so just like for my benefit as well as yours, just to ease the tension. So here's a picture of a landscape. And my question to you is, using just a few words, how would you describe this landscape? Just a few words.
Snowy.
Snowy, okay.
Wintry.
Wintry, all right.
Cheery.
Cheery, okay, yes.
Suburban.
Suburban, yeah, all right.
Crisp.
What, sorry? Crisp?
Crisp.
Okay, yeah. Anything else?
Rural.
Rural, okay. Awesome, thank you. Okay, well, what about this one?
Yay.
Wait, I didn't catch that. Yay! Yay! Okay, yeah, all right, an exclamation, an emotional response. Any other words it evokes?
Recreational.
Recreational, yeah.
Fun.
Fun.
Desolate.
Desolate. Oh, so interesting. Okay, cool, all right. We're
Family
going through
run.
these very swiftly. Huh?
Family run. It looks like a smaller
Yeah.
place, not like snow or
Not
something.
still, right, that's the comparison in my mind too. So, and then finally, what about this landscape? Green.
Fall.
Oh, okay.
Erosion.
There's no like wrong answer, right? That's kind of the point. Erosion, all right.
Manicured.
Manicured, yes.
Sprawl.
Sprawl, yeah. Cool. Well, okay, so thank you for participating in this icebreaker. And I guess the reveal is that all of these photos are from a place called Iron Mountain, which sits on the border of what we call Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So the point of that exercise is really just to show that depending on the perspective that we're taking, as well as the area of focus, as well as some of our own personal experiences and time of year, scale even, what we call the landscape that we see can mean many different things. And Iron Mountain, I selected Iron Mountain because as it turns out, it's also featured in this article by William Freudenberg, Scott Frickel, and Robert Gramling, some very prominent environmental sociologists who talk about this very thing. We talk about how human interpretations of physical landscapes can change over time, as well as cultural, political, and economic context. So in their article, Beyond the Nature Society Divide, Learning to Think About a Mountain, they actually use Iron Mountain as this kind of fixed point when it comes to like a physical and material composition, and how it's been perceived by humans in all these different ways. So they break it down historically, where phase one with the Menominee tribe, the Iron Mountain area was perceived as this hunting ground and living space. And then for a certain period of time, starting in, I guess, the 1830s, with the entry of European capitalists and industrialists, it became this place that was mostly understood as a source for natural resources. And then finally, in the more modern era, starting in the 1950s, as I think some of those resources were depleted, it then became this tourist attraction, and that's where you see some of that skiing infrastructure. So the idea, or the main ideas from this article, are to just say that it really complicates what, like, our understanding of what nature is and how well, or how we position it relative to the human experience. And so their discussion is actually very similar to an article that was written by Grader and Markovich, who back in 1994 wrote this article, Landscapes, the Social Construction of Nature and the Environment. And in that article, they argue that physical and material environments can engender different interpretations. So very similar to the Freudenberg article, but the question that they're focusing on is what interpretation tends to win out. So they combine these questions about different interpretations of the environment with power, and specifically with who in society gets to decide the dominant interpretation or narratives of what the landscape of what the environment is. So who wins out, who wins these contestations of environmental knowledge in a sense. And so I have a couple of examples in mind just to engage more with the different interpretations that we might impose on a certain material environment or landscape. So for example, I do work in agriculture as well. And I think based on your perspective, you might see agricultural fields, for example, being for some people a very exciting and thriving and ecologically interesting landscape, as well as very scientifically interesting as well. But for others, perhaps an agricultural field is not as interesting, is not as diverse, is not as exciting ecologically. And so that's one example of different interpretations of the same landscape, of the same environment, if you will. Another example that I like to give is consider the national park system and the idea of the national parks. So on the one hand, I would argue that the national parks is seen as this escape, if you will, for people who are living in more developed areas to go and experience the wilderness and pristine nature. And yet, as we know, those areas are also very highly cultivated, are very protected deliberately by both policy, as well as a lot of labor to maintain trails, to keep away wildlife that might be disruptive to human activities while they're there, right? So which interpretation wins out is a very compelling question for me and my research. And basically, the big takeaway from this article is who gets to produce knowledge on the environment and shape these interpretations of landscapes really matters. And then finally, this study of who gets to produce knowledge on the environment and how both the who and the actual definition of the environment that we end up landing on as a reflection of social authority and social power is also linked with work by Eric Schwengedow, who works on this area called political ecology. And so political ecology examines how conceptualizations of the environment, of nature, of natural resources, whatever term you prefer, is politics. So what we call the environment and what we ignore and strip away from our definitions of the environment and our formal definitions of the environment is, intended or not, an action of political consequence. So defining the environment in a specific way consolidates and in fact reaffirms someone's worldview while often subordinating someone else's. And Eric Schwengedow demonstrates this with a concept called the hydrosocial cycle. So the hydrosocial cycle, unlike the hydrologic cycle, engages with water as this politically, with this politically imbued medium. So it's not a politically neutral medium ever. Water is carefully tracked, it's carefully studied, it's always coveted because it's necessary for life. So who gets to define it? Who gets to manage it? Who gets to determine whether it's safe? Who gets to distribute it? It reflects enormous power. And importantly, the who is not a singular person. Schwingedow's point is that the who is our way of life. It is our logics and procedures and economies and cultures that have become so natural that they define our society. So the point is from those scholars that the environment has been part of the story of our society all along. And the extent to which the environment is foregrounded is a very interesting puzzle for me. And that's what I often engage with across many different substantive contexts in my own research. And I like to break it down into the following questions. So one question I like to ask is, if the environment is subjectively defined, who or what can stabilize its definition? A second question I like to ask is, how does such stabilization happen? And then the third question I think is of import is also, what are the consequences of that stabilization on our society? And I really like these questions as well, because for me, these are questions that engage with scientific knowledge production, as well as feminist science and decolonial scholarship that I have been drawing on, because they also leverage a lot of critique against Western scientific infrastructures and processes. So what I'm interested in specifically, and what I'm presenting on today, because I did so for my dissertation, is who gets to produce knowledge on environmental factors, and how does that impact science in health and medicine, specifically for type 2 diabetes, as well as what social transformations do our definitions and use of environmental factors actually produce within this context. And so there's a couple of reasons why I decided to focus on type 2 diabetes for my dissertation. So first of all, my family history would indicate that I'm actually at risk for developing type 2 diabetes. But the second reason is that that's actually not very unique at all, because as this map from this review published by Zheng et al. In 2018 indicates, type 2 diabetes is and has been for many decades a growing problem internationally. And its cases have grown so rapidly that this narrative of like it being this genetically inherited disease is no longer sufficient to explain that growth. And so scholars have started turning to things like environmental factors. And that's where my interest was piqued. I started seeing citations of environmental factors more and more, but I couldn't quite glean what types of environments people were referring to. And so I started asking questions like, how are environmental factors being defined? And does defining the environmental factors as we do in medical literature have a real impact on helping prevent type 2 diabetes or manage type 2 diabetes better? And I'm just going to spoil things for you. I will argue no. No, the answer is no, that bringing in environmental factors into scientific discourse has, from my perspective, done very little to prevent type 2 diabetes, as well as improve the management of type 2 diabetes. And for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about why. So to guide the following discussion, I wanted to just break down some of those questions, or rather consolidate some of those questions into these three specific questions about environmental knowledge in type 2 diabetes science. So the first question I ask is, who produces knowledge on environmental factors in type 2 diabetes science? The second question I ask is, what are environmental factors? How are they being defined? And then the third one is, who is responsible for ameliorating environmental factors within this context? Oops. There we go. I guess I was going to say, and the first one we'll tackle is this first question. I think for the sake of time, where am I at? Am I okay? I guess. Yes, I think I'm okay. But anyway, we're going to go through my methods a little bit quickly, but I'm happy to return to the next few slides at the end if you have questions about the methods. But very briefly, I use two main sources to answer those questions that I just presented. So primarily health and medical scholarship, and interviews with health scholars and practitioners. Regarding the scholarship, I ended up examining 160 research articles from 20 peer-reviewed journals that were published between 1990 and 2019. And regarding the interviews, I interviewed 24 participants using that I selected using this purposive sampling procedure, and then later applied an adaptive coding strategy to come up with some conceptualizations that I'll present later on. Sorry. And then just to go into this a little further, this is just a closer look at the journal venues that I examined for that first source. They're ordered roughly by research area, as well as, and then in the middle column or the second column is the titles of the journals themselves. They're also organized by the impact factor, second to the right column, as well as the year that each journal was established. And then so upon selecting this initial set of journal venues, I then went into each of these journals and looked for articles that met this criteria here. So articles that were published between 1990 and 2019, written in English, and they focused on type 2 diabetes, but also mentioned the environment in some way, very broadly. Didn't know what I was going to find yet. So that was a very wide net at that point, as well as a few other things like focus on humans and first authors being in the United States, just so that I understood the context a little better. And then very quickly too, for the interviews, I started conducting interviews in October 19, and then I finished right around March 2020, thank goodness. I remember at the time, actually on a bus from, I think it was New York to Philadelphia, no, Philadelphia to New York. That's when the first cases of COVID were being reported, like I think in Philly and New York. So yeah, kind of just got under the wire. Like I mentioned, followed the propulsive sampling procedure. What that means is had an initial set of people that I wanted to tap, but then also adjusted that as I started to interview and get guided by some of the content that I was collecting. And criteria for the sample was people had to have be more than 18 years of age, have at least 3 years of experience in their professional field, and then work with type 2 diabetes, people living with type 2 diabetes in some capacity. Okay, so returning to the first question of who produces knowledge on type 2 diabetes, I was actually able to answer this question in a couple different ways. So I took the more unusual route of answering this question using journal venues. And so here is a heat map that focuses on the journals that are producing articles on environmental factors from 1990 to 2019. A heat map, just FYI, is a data visualization that shows the magnitude of a certain phenomenon. And in this case, that's the number of articles published per journal. So on the leftmost column, are the journals in my sample, and the percentage contributions for each 5-year period between 1990 and 2019 are in the middle. Ooh, sorry, right here. And then percentages were calculated out of the total articles published for each 5-year period down here. And then these are the totals for each of the 5-year periods. So here you'll notice, because it's a heat map, that color plays a role. So darker reds indicate a greater production of articles and to some degree dominance of the conversation on environmental factors. So overall, you will notice that the map is pale blue. So that indicates that there is no like major actor, with one exception, participating in this conversation on environmental factors within this time period. Like I said, one exception is diabetes care, and they happen to have a greater proportion of the conversation early on in the 90s, but that kind of waned. And then you can see that a couple of journals start to get more engaged in this topic in more recent years. I think the thing to also notice is that the most highly ranked journals, such as medical journals, such as like the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet, with their extraordinary impact factors, nevertheless, like did not participate much at all in this conversation on environmental factors in type 2 diabetes. And then the second way that I end up answering this question of who produces knowledge on type 2 diabetes is to also look at the areas of expertise that are associated with those journal articles. And so in this heat map, we're looking at the number of articles produced by first authors that are associated with these different areas of expertise in this column here, and that's what we'll concentrate on for today. So I pulled areas of expertise from first authors' professional affiliations and their bylines for journal articles. So for example, my professional affiliation is Department of Sociology. So sociology would be my area of expertise. And so many first authors were associated also with multiple areas of expertise. I'm sure that's not a rare thing. So this heat map, I should say, is not like a 1-to-1 ratio of like articles to authors. Nevertheless, it gives us a good depiction of like who's leading the conversation again on environmental factors over time. And so you can see, again, with color playing a role, that there's a lot of people from environmental health and public health that are participating in this discourse. You also have people from nutrition, sorry for blocking everyone, lab medicine and internal medicine, and a few other areas of expertise are present, but not necessarily having a strong effect on this conversation. So I also just want to note that I'm not the only person who's asking questions like this. So about who produces knowledge on something, right? So Nancy Krieger, a social epidemiologist, and her colleagues are asking similar questions. Only they're not looking at environmental factors, they're looking at racism, or rather the absence of racism in the top medical journals. It's actually really extraordinary. I wish I could, is it in here? They reviewed, 200,000 articles over a 30-year period. I don't really know how they did it, but extraordinarily too, they found that less than 1% of those articles contained the word racism anywhere in the text. And then, maybe not so surprisingly, a majority of those articles were opinion pieces and not empirical research. So again, the who and the where this scholarship is showing up really matters for whether or not we can actually see some of that social transformation from our research. Okay. All right, so moving on to the second question of what actually are the environmental factors that are being talked about. There are a couple of conceptualizations that I'm going to focus on today. So the first conceptualization I'm calling not genetic factors. And then the second one, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I'm calling kitchen sink factors. So with not genetic factors, what I found was that scholars were talking about environmental factors as being these like discrete and separate contributors to type 2 diabetes. And so this is a great example of that. I'm just going to read out this quote. So from someone who works in medical genetics in the Lancet, they claim that environmental triggers of disease are most likely to have a major impact on genetically predisposed individuals, and that searching for environmental triggers of multifactorial diseases should be most fruitful when it's focused on those at highest genetic risk. And so they're characterizing environmental factors as this sort of like compounding, layering on, and a separate, almost oppositional contributor to type 2 diabetes from the genetic component. And my research assistant, Emma Wiley, and I are actually digging into this idea of this like oppositional positioning a lot deeper because we find it really interesting. And there's a lot of unanswered questions actually, like what does it mean to be opposites? Are we talking about that genetics and the environment are positioned as opposites because it refers to how precisely we can know each of their effects in the context of type 2 diabetes? Are we talking about differences in biomedical control? Like why are people conceptualizing them as opposites? So a lot more questions regarding this. And then the second conceptualization is what my former advisor, Steph Schuster, calls kitchen sink factors. And this refers to the phrase everything but the kitchen sink, which is what some of these explanations feel like. So if we take a look at this excerpt, and I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I think you could already see sort of like sprinkled throughout all the different references to different types of environments, right? So they have school environments, and they're referring to school lunch programs, they're referring to school boards, they have work environments, they have diet and activity patterns in both adults and children, urban environments, activity behaviors, sidewalks, bikes, athletic fields, they have marketing of certain types of quote unquote bad foods, or I guess energy dense foods. And let's see, and then they also talk about socioeconomic status, and then they kind of like really just keep ramping it up with individual work, school, home environments, communities, national, international scale. So again, just this concept of kitchen sink seems to be a good description of that, since it sort of suggests that this boundary of consideration of environmental factors could potentially be infinite. And if the kitchen sink factors that were being talked about in the previous quote are referring to nearly every aspect of daily living, that's a little troubling because it makes it hard for us to determine like what we should do about it. And there's actually a couple of interview participants that I'm going to concentrate on for today that continue to demonstrate that ambivalence and that uncertainty with like, okay, we know what environmental factors are, but like, what do we do about it? So let's see here. This first participant I'm actually going to read out loud the response to the question of what are environmental factors, because I think they can help me really connect the dots back to some of that subjectivity that we talked about with Freudenberg and others, and why it's so tricky to even land on environmental factors, a definitive environmental factor in the first place. So this is someone who is a social epidemiologist, and when asked what are environmental factors related to type 2 diabetes, they talk about it like this. So they say that oftentimes I hear built environment to include things like parks and gardens and such, but I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. To build a building is one thing, but to have green space is yet another. And some of these things you can control, or others you can't control. I think to have a park is more of a natural, in theory, a natural space, but then when you put a playground on that park, it changes the amount of attention it receives. When you add fences to this park, it's now being defined as a space, whether it's inclusive or not, we'll figure it out. And as soon as you see beer cans or trash not taken out, or broken street lights, or no nets on the hoop, or no backboard and just the hoop, now we have a space that's showing us elements of built physical and social environment. And those things collectively, in my opinion, determine how people will use a resource. So getting back to, there's a lot of lifestyle behavioral work that I think is important for diabetes, but there's also these things, these systems that are structuring resource. When you have all of these environmental pieces coming together, you have evidence of what the power dynamic has been in that space, who gets to control it, and you have a sense of investment in that space. So again, showing this, we know what environmental factors might be, and it might actually be contributing to this feeling of like, what do we do? Where do we start? Very similarly, and I know I'm at 12:30, but I also wanted to highlight another interview participant, this time a geographer, who is also, once again, demonstrating this kitchen sink interpretation of environmental factors, and is also doing it in a critical manner, and is, again, demonstrating these everyday factors as environmental, everyday living situations as environmental factors. So I think just for time's sake, I'm going to concentrate on like the lower half. So here he's talking about food and where we get food and the food environment. But really what he was trying to say was that it's so hard to control for all these things. And right now, a lot of our everyday life is not accommodating our normal life at a human scale. That's not a really good summary, I'm afraid, but I'm being cognizant of time. So we can return to that if you have questions or further interest. So once again, I just wanted to say that I'm not the only one studying this. I'm not the only one asking questions about what are environmental factors in the context of health outcomes of disease among scientists who work within health and medicine, Darling al, as well as Janet Shim, a sociologist who's known for asking these questions. They're also looking at conceptualizations of environmental factors in the context of genomic research. And they found among the scientists that they interviewed, very similar expressions of complexity, of being unsure which aspects of the environment to focus on, and also unsure whether the environment was something that fell within their purview of expertise. All right, so finally, we can ask the question then, or rather, that is taken up in this question of who is responsible for ameliorating environmental factors? This is, again, in my view, a very important question because this is where research can be potentially transformative. But to demonstrate why this isn't the case, I'm returning back to that epidemiologist and geographer and the challenges they've encountered while trying to obtain data to study environmental factors. So with the epidemiologist, I ended up asking them, how do you use data to tell a story that's so important? How do you tell a story of environmental drivers of type 2 diabetes? And the social epidemiologist said, well, the shorter answer is a series of papers, which implies a ton of labor, a lot of time. You can't put all those pieces together. What I find is that I have to do each piece separately with the same data set and then say, as I pointed out in papers A, B, and C, when you're looking at this type of population with this type of exposure, you have to be mindful that other relationships also exist. And typically in quantitative analyses, you don't have enough power to parse out, or you don't have enough power to not end up with segmentation in your data. That segmentation thing is what kills social analyses. You also need to validate your findings across multiple data sets. You're not going to have that richness of data across many data sets. So to me, that's why our social structures, our social systems have been able to evade making permanent change, because as long as you're sure that the data aren't going to be there, because it's so difficult to collect and so difficult to be up to date, there's no evidence they're willing to use that would be sufficient grounds for change. So basically saying like there hasn't been real, what felt real, I guess, genuine investment in data on environmental factors for it to be accessible to people like this person who are, I should say, very much embedded in the community that they're working in and asking really important and urgent questions about safety, about health and safety in their community, and yet they're not able to really show that the environment does play an impact on their community health. And again, I think for time's sake, I might skip over this interview participant, but I'm happy to return to it. But just one, really to cap off that who is responsible for ameliorating environmental factors and their potentially adverse impacts on our health. Well, we know that data is a barrier, and once again, I'm saying that I'm not the only one asking questions about this. So Scott Frickel and his colleagues have written this paper called Undone Science, which I really love. They're demonstrating how, they actually focus on environmental factors within this paper because it's characterized by, or rather the lack of environmental data is characterized by the, I guess, reluctance of funding and political institutions, and they often deem to fund studies to collect environmental data because they often deem environmental data as being too complex to study. So it makes sense that some of these scholars are saying that that data is difficult to acquire because there's actually no data. And people and institutions who could enable that research have decided not to. That argument of like the environment being too complex to study doesn't really sit well with me personally. I happen to have a partner who is a nuclear physicist. I know that complexity is not the thing that is scaring off some of these funding institutions, some of these political institutions. So that's where another set of questions can start to be asked, right? Like, so what is preventing some of this data from being collected? All right, to wrap it up, in conclusion, to go back to those original questions of who's producing knowledge on environmental factors in type 2 diabetes, what are those environmental factors, as well as who's responsible for ameliorating them once we've defined them. In my work, I have been able to find some partial answers. So to some extent, public health scholars are driving environmental knowledge production in type 2 diabetes science, and then partially due to its ability to engender the subjective interpretations, environmental factors are interpreted as not genetic kitchen sink factors, and that makes them very difficult to study. The data is not there or is difficult to acquire, and based on some part of the literature, but mostly the interviews, it's not really clear who's responsible for acquiring data or finding out more about environmental factors or translating findings to practices that can influence individual health. But sociologists always like to ask the question, well, who benefits from a certain action, from a certain situation? In the meantime, scholars do benefit from producing knowledge on environmental factors, but that's very confined to, as Nancy Krieger and then pointed out, a very specific venue, in this case, research articles. So there is that. And I will just say that I continue to grapple with these puzzles, with these questions, drawing from the things I love, STS, feminist science, and decolonial studies. Very interested in hearing your feedback and thoughts, and thank you very much.